Your answer to the question, how do we bridge between personal transformation and systemic change?
This might sound a little bit roundabout, but I think...
Roundabout is okay.
Okay, the shortest distance between two paths is usually a superhighway, leaving out some important scenic details. Years ago, I did a lot of research on how people behave in disasters. I was partly in response to Hurricane Katrina, where the myth, which is not just a myth specific to disasters, but a set of assumptions about human nature, amplified something that was already a disaster and made it far, far worse. The myth was that human beings are basically cowardly, selfish, venal, criminal, etc., and it justifies authoritarianism. I had just before Katrina done a lot of work on the 1906 earthquake that leveled half of San Francisco, less because of the earthquake than because of fires mismanaged by the authorities, partly out of the same mindset, fear of the public, treating them as an enemy, preventing them from fighting fire, not recognizing their own incompetence, as authorities so often do. But what actually happens, as disaster sociologists have shown us in disaster, is that most people are what they call prosocial. They're deeply empathic, deeply engaged, often incredibly courageous and creative in rescuing each other and recreating the systems of survival. And that's become much better known. I don't see the disaster myth spreading as much. I researched this deeply for a book called A Paradise Built in Hell, really thinking that the era we were entering of climate crisis was going to be an era of both bigger disasters and more disasters, and who we really are is essential to that. And there's these underlying assumptions in how we organize society about human nature, and they often remain that people are basically selfish, which is, the other face of loneliness of like, I have nothing in common with you, I owe you nothing, I don't care about you, which is part of how you get lonely. What was astonishing for me about disasters, and I found again and again, talking to people who'd been in the Twin Towers in 9/11, talking to people in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, reading accounts of people in the Mexico City earthquake of 1985, and actually talking to some people who'd been through it, and reading earlier accounts, is not just that people behave well, that they take care of each other, that they become remarkably communal and remarkably creative and remarkably courageous. We could call those the 3 C's. 3 other C's, but that they find this extraordinary joy in the last place you would ever expect to find it. Your city is in ruins, lots of people have died, you've lost everything. You find this shining joy. It is so astounding, and it's in the 1906 earthquake. It's, Hurricane Katrina was so drenched in racism and classism, it was a little modulated, but you do find it there. You found these stories of selflessness. And the Twin Towers in New York City were towers of capitalism, a very ideology of selfishness and competition. And yet a paralyzed quadriplegic was carried down 69 floors by his co-workers, a paraplegic accountant. They did not abandon him. Nobody panicked, nobody stampeded. Everybody was incredibly gracious and helpful and made room for each other. A young man told a story in an oral history with absolute unself-consciousness, not thinking how counter it was to who we think we are and how we behave, where he said he was fleeing with his co-workers, not his family, not his best friends, just his co-workers, from the collapsing building, and to be caught in that probably meant certain death. And he said, well, I was an athlete in college, so I was a little faster than everybody else, so I slowed down. But that joy speaks to what we really want. We want deep connection. We want belonging. It almost felt like what people had was a kind of sudden awakening. If Buddhism is a discipline to become awake, this was like being shaken awake, like an earthquake can do to you. Suddenly, you can no longer worry about the past or future. You live in an intensified present. You have everything in common with the people around you. You're experiencing the literal non-separation with the earthquake that collapsed my house also collapsed your house. And we have to figure out how to get the people in the third house out together and maybe build a soup kitchen, as people tend to do, or some improvised shelter. And so people really want meaning, they want purpose, they want connection, they want community, they want agency, they want a voice. That's who we really are. And disaster shows us that. So I think creating the counter narratives that let us fulfill our deepest personal needs also creates a society that can address climate, can address loneliness, can address violence, can address inequality. It takes a huge amount of advertising and promotion and propaganda and lies to tell us that we're separate, that we just need to buy lots of shit from Amazon, that, we need to have a bigger yacht than the neighbors. And what's amazing to me is even the people invested in that, and one of the people I interviewed was a Morgan Stanley banker, high-level executive. A lot of people like that did not operate like capitalists when the towers collapsed. They operated in this deeply communal and empathic way. And so I think that is kind of what I've got in answer to that question. And that's not what I expected to find when I started by looking at the 1906 earthquake and was shocked to find stories of joy and kind of almost euphoria over and over, people breaking out of the disaster of everyday life, which is meaninglessness, isolation, alienation, work that isn't purposeful, doesn't serve your highest goals. And so that for me has been a real torch to sort of plunge into these dark times.
I have to say, however,
Okay.
Okay.
that human nature, it's interesting that we call it human nature. Right?
Yeah.
Human and nature together. But that characteristic of human nature that you researched and that you saw there, Rebecca, was in response to what I would call an acute emergency situation. And that when we have those acute emergency situations, the Twin Towers, a earthquake, a flood, then the best of human nature comes out. And it is a confirmation that that is where our innate roots are. But the question is, can we stay consistent with those roots in the face of a chronic emergency, not of an acute emergency? Because climate is a chronic emergency. This is an emergency that is going to be with us for many years. It is not that the Twin Towers fell. So how do we nourish a very deep well of not just yearning to be with each other, but yearning to be supportive, to be in solidarity, to be helpful with each other in the absence of an acute emergency and in recognition of a chronic emergency? Because that's the piece that is not quite evident.
I do have an answer. It sounds like...
Well, I would just say that the human dilemma is a chronic emergency in a certain way.
Everyday life is a chronic emergency.
Right, everyday life is a chronic emergency, as you say. But the magnitude and scale and also the longevity, the potential longevity of this situation. So, as I was pointing toward two paths, they're not entirely separate, but they're also, we look at, the pandemic produced a certain mindset, for example, certain understandings, realizations, and so forth. So what Rebecca's talking about is in terms of the crisis, of these natural and human disasters like war. That's a human-created disaster from the get-go. And, it, as you say, our deeper nature, both positively and negatively, very deep part of our nature is also not so wholesome. But in any case, our deepest nature is, from the perspective that we understand or have touched into. So there are these two paths, and it is this kind of ongoing process of working with your own views and how your mind operates, and also being very intentional about, about care, about community and connection. And, it takes, in a certain way, a moral and ethical code that is both, social, And it's embedded, within our economic structures, and it's embedded with how we educate, embedded within our medical systems and so forth. That's the ethical dimension, but the moral aspect, has to do with our deepest values and returning again and again to how these values are affecting not only ourselves and others, but understanding that view of interconnectedness is really critical of us, vowing to do the least amount of harm possible and to serve as benefit as many as possible. And, I wanted to, I want to hear what you have to say in reflection, Rebecca, and then.
Yeah, no, I said that a sudden disaster is like it shakes you out of your slumbers. People suddenly wake up to their own capacity, to their deepest desires and their deepest joy. It's like Buddhism has been dumped on you in a way. But most people fall asleep again. And I think that's partly because we don't even have a language for these desires. We don't talk about them. This is not the version of who we are that advertisers, are going to sell you, that you're going to hear about from many places. And so that was one of the big questions for me when I did this work was, what keeps people awake? The Mexico City earthquake was actually different in that I think Mexican society was more open than the US, Canadian, and UK disasters that I looked at. People made major changes. You're probably very aware of it was the beginning of the end of one-party rule in Mexico. There was an incredible housing rights movement. The seamstresses who had been crushed in the sweatshops formed unions with huge popular support. So very specific things happened. But so Mexicans were able to take from the earthquake in the DF an opportunity to change things more deeply towards a more egalitarian, communitarian, and compassionate society. But the real answer for me was, okay, so people are suddenly shaken awake, but it doesn't last. The answer is you need a discipline of awareness, which is exactly, brings us back to Buddhism. And I will just footnote that by saying, when I wrote the book, I imagined it came out in 2009. I imagined that we would deal with the kind of disasters we have seen, but not with the ongoing disaster, which is so easy to normalize and accept. Frogs do actually jump out of the water when it gets too hot. But we do, and it is weird looking at where we are already, where I think people are not saying enough. We didn't used to have fire like this. We didn't, we shouldn't be in a world where fire is like this. Thinking of Canada now, of what I as a Californian have experienced with, starting in 2017, a completely different kind of fire. So we need the discipline, but I think discipline is a word that makes people think about eating their spinach, even though we know you love spinach more than anything. But I think it's not unconnected to that joy. And so we probably have to talk about discipline, but I want to also talk about joy. That in the same way that I talk about abundance. I did a wonderful event with a climate activist and poet and climate lawyer, Julian Agwan, who recently won that extraordinary case for the nation of Vanuatu at the United Nations, and who wrote a wonderful book called No Country for 8-Spot Butterflies. And as somebody in Guam, as part of the kind of threatened island nations of the Pacific, I didn't know how he would be, whether he'd be grim or bitter or a victim. There were so many ways that he could have addressed where he's standing. So he did this event, and he murmured to me before we started with the public, make sure we talk about beauty, joy, and abundance. And, and so I think we have to do this work, but we have to never forget beauty, joy, and abundance. And that desire, which can lead us in terrible directions, can also lead us in wonderful directions. What I discovered in disaster is those desires that I think lead us in wonderful directions, and that capacity for sudden awakening, even if it doesn't last, that does tell us something about human nature, contrary to what almost everything else tells us. And so much of the lack of belief we can do what climate requires of us is a lack of faith in other human beings, because we have this grim, rather cynical view of human nature. So I think all those things are part of the work we have to do of offering people joy, beauty, and abundance reminding of them of their own deepest desires at their best, and finding disciplines to keep us awake in the ways that keep us non-separate.